Let's talk about debt, government debt. All governments, or at least nearly all governments in nearly all times, run up debt. And then they get worried about it and they have to think, what can they do to reduce it?
But economists, policymakers, and politicians have warned that a debt crisis is looming, where the U.S. won't be able to pay its bills, or where it's already so deep in debt when the next crisis hits that it can't spend its way out of it.
Don't agree on any of these issues. For example, here's one saying, debt, you've got to reduce it.
We certainly do need a growth strategy. The problem is that the strategy they advocate for, at least in the short term stimulating growth, is high levels of government spending, a fiscal stimulus in other words. There is no evidence that this would actually do the job.
And here's another saying, debt, you can live with it, don't worry, it'll basically disappear by itself.
Short put it.
And we can still issue that and in effect not repay it. If you never repay it, the debt to GDP ratio will still eventually converge. It will never explode. It's fairly clever. It can be done.
Why do we have this disagreement amongst mainstream economists' views? Well, essentially because there's no one standard model, for instance, as they have in physics, where people can refer to it and say, this is the answer. Now, in previous videos in this series, we have developed a common sense model of the economy. It is based on confidence, on heuristic decision making, on people taking credit, and on debt levels. So we'll call this the CHCD model for short. This provides one reference point. We can interrogate this model and ask what are the outcomes depending upon levels of debt we build up and what we do about debt to reduce it. But first, in order to do this, we've got to actually introduce the government and taxation and its debt rising abilities into that model. So the first thing we'll do is to add the government and taxation into the existing model we've described before. So we're going to make a simple assumption that both firms and workers, everybody, is taxed at 30% of their income level, that the government by default will spend all the tax that it receives, but occasionally it may borrow more or it may decide to save and spend a bit less. But government spend is mainly on transfers between areas of the economy, so typically from rich firms to poor workers, and on services, that's consumption of goods, so for example social services in most economies, and there's also spend on investment, such as building roads, providing other forms of transport, perhaps health services, and other things that are capital expenditures for the good of the country. And we're going to assume that, roughly speaking, 80% of the government spend will be on consumption services and about 20% is on capital investments. Obviously, we could change that, but it'll just do for now. We're also going to assume that during recessions, dips in the economy's performance, the government will step in to save some sections of the population starving to death. So there are social security programs, and they of course become more expensive during a recession. More people are out of work, more people need support. Therefore, the government will borrow additional funds just for those periods in order to make sure everybody can live a moderately happy life. And this can also happen during other emergencies, wars, COVID, whatever. So in general, we have a system where the government is going to develop debt because even if it keeps its spending down to only the taxes it collects, there will be these occasions, recessions and other emergencies, where it does need to borrow in order to keep society functioning at a reasonable level. Having added the government into our CHCD model, what happens if in fact the government sets the tax level at zero? There is no tax. We then get this result for the economy. You can see that the government debt mounts because it's occasionally giving support to workers during those recessions. Now, if tax is present at roughly this 30% level, and the government doesn't actually save anything, it simply does spend exactly all the tax it collects in, then effectively what it's doing is redistributing cash from some sectors of the economy to other sectors, but the total amount remains the same. In fact, because we've said that it's going to spend 80% on consumption and only 20% on investment, essentially what this means is that the government is removing a bit of investment from the economy and increasing the consumption spend. And this is what happens if it does that. We can see that the government debt still mounts because we haven't allowed the government at any point to save. Now, if we do let the government save, that is to spend less than the tax intake, and we assume that it does this saving during the periods when there are high debt in order to keep the debt down, we essentially have what's called austerity. The government stops some spending in order to save. Here's what happens in that case. We can see that after time 35, the government starts to save. So debt is kept down. But the penalty for this is that we get reduced GDP, reduced growth, and we get periods of deflation. So austerity is one possibility to keep debt in check. But there are others. For example, we could say that once debt reaches a high level, what happens is that the government stops any additional borrowing, simply spends the tax intake that's available, and waits for economic growth to mean that the debt shrinks in proportion to the expanded size of the economy. This only makes sense if the government is actually spending more than its tax intake, because then, when the debt rises, it can stop spending more and just spend exactly the tax. So in order to see the effect of this in the model, we first of all have to allow the government to spend more than the tax. We'll allow it to spend 10% more, and that 10% will, of course, have to have been borrowed. So to see the effect of this policy, we need first to look at what happens if the government has that 10% overspend, but does not save at any point, and then compare that to having the 10% overspend, but removing it when debt is high. So first of all, here's what happens if we have 10% overspend and the government does not at any point make any savings. In this case, not surprisingly, since we're not allowing savings, government debt continues to mount, it's not controlled, and the total units bought we can note end up at about 30. Spirits are on the way down. For this case, austerity, we can see that the reduction in spending does well control the government debt. That's kept at a relatively low level. But on the other hand, the total units bought end up at only about 20, a significant reduction in economic growth, and spirits are continuing to decline. And now we can compare that with what happens when the government does make savings by cutting out the additional borrowing to spend when debt is high. You can see in this scenario that the government borrows up to time 20 while the debt is still low, and then it sticks to just spending its tax intake until the debt drops. Debt is controlled, it's at a higher level than under austerity, but it's not continually increasing, and at the same time the economic growth is much better. It ends up here at about 40. So this situation, which also shows increasing levels of spirits at the end, seems to have several advantages over the others. It would seem to be a better policy. So just summarising what we've said so far, Of the policies we've looked at, which is simply to keep on spending and never try to save, that's fairly unsustainable because government debt simply grows and grows and at some point is going to overwhelm the economy. We can introduce austerity once debt gets high, and that will control the debt, but there's a strong cost in terms of lowering growth. Or we can simply reduce the amount of spending down to the tax available, and this will also control the amount of debt but still maintain a healthier level of growth. So, overall, this last policy seems to give us the best of most worlds. Now, how about the question of printing money instead of borrowing? This is something that's been thrown around from time to time, and on the face of it, printing money seems very attractive. Why not print money? Then you don't have to pay it back or pay interest on it, whereas with borrowing, you do. And the classical answer, look any way you like online, will be that if you print money, you're going to get bad inflation. Is this true? It all seems to stem from the views of people like Milton Friedman, who claimed that inflation is entirely down to governments printing more money than they should.
The reason we have inflation in the United States, or for that matter anywhere in the world, is because these pieces of paper and the accompanying book entries, or their counterparts in other nations, are growing more rapidly than the quantity of goods and services produced. The truth is, inflation is made in one place and one place only, here in Washington.
Let's use our model to find out. Let's compare what happens if the government, just going along spending its tax intake, either borrows, we're going to let it borrow from time period 27 to 30, or prints money from time periods 27 to 30, the same amount of money being borrowed or printed. What's the difference in the economic outcomes? Let's look at the period immediately after the borrowing or printing of money, so the period from time 30 to time 40. Printing gives higher growth, about 10% higher GDP than the borrowing, and it also gives higher inflation. Time 30 to time 35, it's about 8% for printing and about 7% for borrowing. And printing also gives a higher peak inflation at time around 38. Now, these results obviously depend upon the amount borrowed, the particular timing in the business cycle, and when the money is repaid if we're borrowing. But there's no conclusion that printing money is specifically worse than borrowing, and there certainly isn't a giant increase in inflation as a result of printing money. In all these cases so far, the level of government debt that we've been controlling has been fairly low. Now, let's relax the constraints on the government borrowing a little bit so that it allows itself to build up higher debt. If we do this, and then we introduce an austerity policy once debt reaches high levels, we get the following outcome. First of all, you can see that the GDP reaches a higher level than the previous output, where we were only allowing low government debt to exist and instituted an austerity policy. So it seems that government flexibility on debt, allowing itself room for higher levels of debt, actually is a good thing for the economy. I compare this with the same situation. We're allowing the government to accumulate higher levels of debt, and once a high level is reached, we decide to print money rather than going into austerity, then we get the following outcomes. We can see there's a spike in inflation when we print the money, but that spike quickly disappears, and we get a much higher GDP outcome than we did under austerity. So the immediate conclusion from running this model under those two conditions is that printing money to reduce debt is a viable policy as long as the government can overcome its inbred fear of inflation. As Keynes said, all practical men of business are slaves to some defunct economist, and the defunct economist that governments are slaves to is Milton Friedman. So, summing up, using the CHCD model with government and taxation introduced into it, we find the following. Government borrowing is good, within reason. It generally tends to promote economic growth, and it doesn't have a giant effect on inflation. When government debt is high, the best policy is to simply reduce any additional borrowing and simply spend whatever your tax intake is. And there's an alternative to that, which is you may consider printing money. You probably wouldn't want to overdo it, but printing money can be a useful policy tool. Austerity is very clearly the worst policy, and yet it's the one that many, if not most governments in high debt situations follow. That's fairly extraordinary. And finally, worries about inflation from government actions, particularly printing money, these are distinctly overdone. Now that we have this augmented CHCD model, including the government's role, we can go on in some future videos to examine many other economic issues.